Amen. This is the one presentation that I have between two camp meetings. We had the German camp meeting and we're soon to have the Brazilian camp meeting. There's nothing that's been taught over the last at least 10 months that isn't linked. We've been following the same thought since May. Which would make sense. We are in the increase of knowledge. But being between these two camp meetings, I have not wanted to introduce a radically new topic. Or begin something that would not be followed on for another 2 weeks. So what I thought to do today is hopefully more interactive. If people want to write on the chat, I'll try and make it that way. And what really is more of a review of some of the things that we have been looking at over the last months. Now, I don't like summaries. So this isn't really intended as a summary. But I would like to remind us of some key points. When we began our, I think it was French camp meeting, with Le Grand Cri, it was began with one line from Eden to the second Advent. And in constructing that line from Eden to the second Advent, I was hoping to illustrate more the difficulty that God has trying to communicate his character to his people. If we were to think of Eden to the second Advent. Now, sin comes. With sin comes inequality. To remind us, this all happened quite quickly. Cain was not born, he was not thrown out of the garden. So there is little time between creation and everything going wrong. The world quickly descends into chaos, where the strong control and abuse the weak. And Ellen White describes that time as one of abuse and slavery. that abuse and slavery reaches a point where God decides he has to end it. And that is the flood. New inequality arises. And then what we do through our reform lines is really just try and identify how God is trying to sort out this problem. Because we would argue, based upon all of our methodology, that you should know God's character greater than Abraham ever did. And we just use the simple example of slavery to give evidence. But God is limited. A traditional Adventist would say there's nothing God can't do. But at the time when Abraham is alive, there were peoples in what we would describe as Asia today There were peoples in Africa today and groups arising in what we would describe as North and South America today. And Australia and islands. So, knowing that that's a complicated subject, but just one thread. Doesn't God want to reach them all? And yet He's restrained in this small geographical area. Is that because those people aren't worth the same? I would argue it's because God is limited. He has to wait for a dispensation when they get written language. Then He'll wait for another one where they get roads and peace on sea. Then He'll wait for the printing press. Then He'll wait for rail. And canals and cars. And the telegraph. And then He'll wait for the World Wide Web. So we're looking at 6,000 years of God being limited as He tries to deal with the sin problem and communicate to humanity His character. The same thing He was trying to communicate to Adam and Eve. So This history, this thread alone shows us God is limited. But the power of our current dispensation, evidenced through what we're doing right now, where except for tyrannical governments, there doesn't need to be dark spots. Where the message can't reach. So God is limited. Limited by means of communication. But also limited by the failings of his people. God's people tend to be stiff-necked. What does that mean? When someone has a stiff neck, maybe you're meant to look at it from a different perspective. If I look at the screen this way, or at this pen this way, I can only see one thing. But maybe I have to turn and look at it a different way. I'm stuck. I'm unwilling to change. Therefore, I can learn nothing new. So if God is dealing with a stiff-necked people, who stubbornly want to conserve their one view, even after God says that view is not fit for purpose, God has to lead them slowly. If he doesn't lead them slowly, he will destroy them. Polygamy was not a good idea 4,000 years ago. It wasn't a good idea for David. And yet God tolerated things. He didn't like them, but he tolerated them. Meat eating. Didn't like it, tolerated it. Slavery. Didn't like it, tolerated it. Because God is stuck. Just as he is back in the time of Moses, if he wants to reach someone in the farthest coast of China today. God's people being stiff-necked, he leads them slowly. But he leads them through two particular movements. Which we have described as ancient Israel and modern Israel. If he's going to work through humanity, he needs to have a people to communicate with, and be as a light to the world. So we have ancient Israel. At the end of a time prophecy, they come out of darkness. God has to reinstitute the Sabbath. He makes one call to the church, one call to the world. They're stiff-necked. They hold on to paganism. So they go through the trial of captivity in Babylon. Let go of any acceptance of idol worship. Egypt, Babylon. And at the end of that, the history of that movement, in the time period of their captivity to Rome, God again gives them an increase of knowledge. But the people can't see it because they are stiff-necked. They can't learn anything new. That's ancient Israel. We know that modern Israel follows the same pattern. This is what we have been studying since May. 1798. End of a time prophecy. One call to the church, one call to the world. The Sabbath is reinstituted in that history. And then in 1888 history, the importance of the Sabbath is driven home. Around the time of Babylon, no one would dare construct another idol. They knew that idol worship was the direct opposite of worshipping Jehovah. So they abandoned that form. It would no longer be considered. You wouldn't even think about constructing an idol in Jerusalem. In 1888, they're cured of any attempt to worship on Sunday. As an Adventist, you would not even consider that. Idol worship is the opposite of anything considered Jewish. Sunday worship is considered the opposite of anything Adventist. We were cured in that history. We are in our Omega. And the issues they faced at the end of ancient Israel are identified at the end of modern Israel. So you could lay these two movements side by side and see the 6,000 years of progression that God has been attempting. But what we have done is we have compared and contrasted these two movements. So we can use ancient Israel to teach us of modern Israel. And to do that, you have to both compare and contrast the two movements. The majority of what ancient Israel had to learn here what was particularly radical to their Jewish way of thinking was all taught to them in the first part of that history. In the history of the disciples under John and Christ. Now, I'm not saying Paul doesn't have an increase of knowledge. There isn't information. But the radically new happens in the first 31 years of that history. And that is the same for us. How can God prepare a group of people to take a message to the world if there's fundamental things that they don't understand? They don't understand the nature of the kingdom. So they're taught here and then they share. This is where they straighten out their doctrine. All in preparation before they share that doctrine. And this work is ours. If I can blow this up. The line of the disciples or the priests. The line of what should be you. So we can see this line a couple of different ways. Comparing it and contrasting it with ancient Israel. Or as the end result of 6,000 years of effort. Where we are talking over a platform that is connecting people from multiple continents all over the world, and we discuss the preparation that must be made for Eden. Six 6,000 years of progression. So the radical education of this first group it occurs in 4 dispensations. Ploughing, early rain, latter rain, harvest. The fundamental concepts of our methodology are given. Line upon line is given. Time is given. And it's our final 2 dispensations that I want to discuss. Our methodology of line upon line has become so much more precise. So when we come down to this history, we're now able to identify that there are 4 dispensations. We're able to place into that developing structure an increase of knowledge and a formalization. And more recently, we're able to see the nature of a waymark. How waymarks work and how fractals work. So our whole methodology has become very, very precise, very refined. And to refer to something that was taught, I think a couple months ago now, we need to see this in 2 different ways. Repeating pattern. Boston, Concord, Exeter. But at the same time we have that repeating pattern, there are certain waymarks that still have special characteristics. We discussed that when we discussed fractals. The Sunday law. Daniel 11:41. And what we understood is this is the line of the 144,000. But through fractals you can see 3 Sunday laws before it. (14, 19, 21). All of which can be described as a shadow of the Sunday law. All of which show us a development of that process. But there is only one Sunday law on our reform line. There is only one Daniel 11:41. So you can see the repeating pattern. But it works as the fulfillment of that verse. And the structure gives us the shadows or the development of that verse. So when we come to our latter rain and we see the midnight cry, there is only one midnight cry for the end of ancient Israel. There is only one midnight cry that lines up with the Exeter camp meeting. So this might be a formalisation and this might be a formalisation. And this is a formalisation. But there is only one midnight cry. And this becomes important to understand. Because Ellen White was standing here in Millerite history when she said that the light of this event is what lit up their path all the way to the second advent. Now, someone asked me last week, what if they can't remember all the material of the midnight cry? And I did not want to take away the responsibility they have to go back and study it. But a core principle of the midnight cry what was the core principle? The chat's gone quiet. I'm not sure what CD means. I know it means something good. Equality, internal, external, Acts 27. 1 + 2 = 3. All good answers. I would suggest the core principle was 2 streams of information. Because 2 streams of information told us what was good and what was bad. Social conservatism, bad. Social liberalism, good. Hitler, bad. Churchill, good. Conservative Protestantism, the danger. Which was the power that gave rise to Trump. To Bolsonaro. To right-wing leaders all over the world. So when we are over here and studying the history of the Covenanters, we're on the path, walking in the light of the midnight cry. We have not changed subjects from that message. We are studying and understanding better the midnight cry. When you read that document that discusses the three histories of Protestant movements, you are studying the midnight cry. That message, that light is not left behind. We are still in it. And we continue to study that message and grow in it. If you are studying maths and you're little and you learn 2 + 2 = 4, you're studying maths. And then when you're much older and you get into things like calculus, you're still studying the same subject. But you took some lessons and a test. You took some lessons and a test. It got harder, but it's the same subject. So we are studying the Midnight Cry message last year and this year. It's not something that we leave behind us and move on from. And studying that document is just a key example of that. I want to discuss some comparisons and some differences between our last dispensation and our current one. I want to suggest this last dispensation was easy. This was easy. This was simple. This is hard. And I want to explain why. If you want to carve a statue, out of wood, you might start with this big tree trunk and how will you start? You're likely to just take an axe. Or a chainsaw. Hard, brutal blows. Cutting away the majority of what should not be there. The big features. That was the previous dispensation. God made hard, cutting blows. This was easy. It was good versus evil. Good versus evil. It was Churchill versus Hitler. It was North versus South. Simple. People here in the movement said we don't agree with that, we don't believe that. We reject equality. And they left this movement. Enter a new dispensation. And what starts happening to our message? This is easy, good versus evil. True versus counterfeit. And what's the first message that we start to cover in this history? Early 2020. The first subject was compromise. To do that, we covered the end of ancient Israel, this history. Yes, the wilderness time. Then what did we study? The end of the school in Portugal. Was like the prelim to our increase of knowledge. We started to attack someone. We destroyed his reputation. Who did we attack? Before Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln. Now we're starting to get into difficult territory. And I think people in this dispensation are much more confused about what our message is. People are confused and disorientated. Just as you would be when you move into a much harder math class. Many of us united excitedly in this history. But because it was so clear-cut and simple. And in our own history, I see many people struggling. I would suggest a major reason that they feel unnerved, uncomfortable, is because they don't realize there has been this transition in our message. where we are no longer talking about Churchill versus Hitler. North versus South, true versus counterfeit. Trump versus Clinton. That's a simple message for the previous dispensation. And people are struggling to make the transition to the harder test. The wilderness time. Abraham Lincoln. Then when we touched on Millerite history, no longer arguing about North versus South and who was good and who was bad. Now it's all about Henry Clay and the Whig Party. It's not a subject of good versus evil. Then we revisited these conservative Protestants and who did we end up attacking? Back here, we're just pointing to Jerry Falwell. And saying, evil. Who do we end up attacking here when we discuss conservative Protestantism? Covenanters? Calvin. Calvin and Knox. Our heroes. These are original Protestant reformers. Back here, good versus evil, we would have approached the Protestant Reformation and seen Protestant reformers good, papacy evil. But when we approach it here, God does not let us do that. We should be well past what is a simple understanding. And it's in failing to make that transition that I would suggest many people are struggling. Where they feel our message is not as clear as it used to be. A year ago, 2 years ago. It's not as simple. If you graduated, the class got harder. That's one way we can see this dispensation. I had an article put on the media broadcast yesterday evening. That is one demonstration of this. And I would suggest if it's carefully considered, it also has implications for how we view our internal duty. Now, I may not agree with everything that the author says, or believes privately. Or shares in other articles he writes. But that's the case for practically every author shared. The point that he is making is that many on the left are looking at the riots in the US Capitol and saying America had this coming. They keep intervening in foreign conflicts, messing around with other countries' governments, and now finally they get to know what that feels like. And the author's argument is that is too simple. It's similar to what we said here. The United States, it's hypocrisy. The Gulf War, bad idea. The Iraq War, bad idea. The Afghanistan effort to destroy the Taliban, bad idea. Overthrowing democracy in Iran was a bad idea. So back in this history, it's nice and simple. America is a global bully. Interfering in other countries' politics. To promote their own position as the global leading power. So their position on the world stage does not become threatened. And simple message, go home, take care of your own democracy, stop interfering. And this author is saying that's a simplistic argument. I won't go through all of his points as he develops his case, but he's able to use a number of examples where he shows that nationalism and racism are more complex subjects, and they are so pervasive that they that those exact same nationalistic principles can be and have been used to end or prevent American intervention. And the example that he gave was Donald Trump, when for years the Kurds had supported them in Syria. That to please his Turkish ally, he withdraws American troops, leaves the Kurds vulnerable, and says there's a lot of sand that they can play with. In other words, these people have been fighting over sand for hundreds of years. Implication, they're naturally violent. They're all troublemakers anyway. Let's take care of our own nation. Let's build walls. Bring our troops home. Let whatever dictator force wants to commit genocide go ahead. Let whatever foreign economy crumble under our sanctions. And our protectionist trade policies. Take care of America. And forget the needs in the rest of the world. So Donald Trump used the same racism and nationalism to argue that America should not intervene in other countries' politics. The core issue is more subtle. It's too simple to say good versus evil. Like US mind its own business, US intervention. Because I would argue that the Kurds should be protected. That international genocide should not go unchallenged. Therefore, there are cases where countries intervene in another country's politics. I won't go further into that article for time. But he makes multiple relevant and good points. One point is just the issue with their mindset. their belief in US exceptionalism. They have this messianic faith in their own ability that they can spread democracy, but because they are somehow better than the rest of the world, they have not seen their democracy as being as fragile as it is. So what he says the answer is not for the United States to necessarily stop intervening, but it joins a global fight for democracy with both conviction and humility. So even when it comes to the foreign policy decisions that America has made, the position that this movement takes, based on prophecy, is not so simple as to say American intervention bad complete freedom in other countries good. Complete freedom of other governments to abuse their population without consequences. We start to get into danger when we slip back into simplistic models. There is nothing wrong with these models. There is no model where we're going to start softening our message on Hitler in comparison to Churchill. But seeing the complexity of these issues, directly impacts how we see the complexity of running this movement. See, back in this dispensation, a brother who was actually a board member of a ministry said he loved this message of equality, and now we did not need an organizational system in this movement. Everyone was free to practice equality. Therefore, you needed no structure. In other words, no one need intervene in another person's business. Because that is what organization is all about. No one need intervene in another ministry's operations. That ministry should have freedom to decide their own structure, their own way of operating. And people have become increasingly confused in this history. As they find that Elder Parminder and myself have not given them that freedom. It seems in conflict with the simple message of the last dispensation. There are two parables we're given here to explain our current experience. The first was the disciples. What does that tell us? Do people get equality? No. Second message. Why is it that at our increase of knowledge, our very increase of knowledge is the story of the golden calf? Why is our increase of knowledge the golden calf? Why did God choose that story to be the story we needed to understand more than any other in our current dispensation? The story of the Apis bull. What it tells us is that the reason that the Jewish nation failed is they blended. Right back here, Jehovah says, "This is what I am." And what they do is they take their favourite pieces from paganism and they take what they've learnt about Jehovah and they blend the two. It's paganism plus God. And they are never able to shake that understanding. What Adventism did is they blended Protestantism, the very Protestant covenanters that they'd fought against in 1888, back in ancient Israel, they would never consider building an idol. Yet when they look at Christ, they reject him. It's because they're still worshipping the character of that idol. They let go of the form, professed acceptance in the message, and held on to the characteristics and the spirit of that idol. They would never consider the form. But they are worshipping the form. Through their love of the Spirit. Adventism today would never consider keeping Sunday. They would never consider meeting at church on a Sunday and moving from one day to the next. And yet they worship Sunday. Because they still worship the spirit of Protestantism. They follow, give homage to the Covenanters' beliefs. And those beliefs in our dispensation, when it's all about marriage, that homage exhibits itself as nationalism, sexism, and homophobia. So the structure is Sunday. The spirit is nationalism, sexism, homophobia. We abandoned the form, we kept the spirit. So God gives us two messages. First of all, you're the disciples. Second of all, you're still worshipping the Spirit. When we discuss these more complex subjects, where did they go wrong? Take the Whig Party. Take Abraham Lincoln's racist statements. In 1858, what does he do wrong? There's an end result, which would mean his victory. This isn't the election. This was another government position. I forget what it's called. He wants success, and he knows the means to that success is Southern votes. Have you ever heard the phrase, the end justifies the means? Henry Clay. There was a Senate. He wanted the Senate. Thank you. Henry Clay. He wants to avoid civil war. He wants unity. So, 1850 compromise. I like that, Sister Michaela. Aaron. Peace in the camp. If he doesn't have peace in the camp, God's people could descend into violence. The whole movement could crumble. For the sake of peace, do what the people ask you to do. Shouldn't he be an elected leader? Shouldn't they be a democracy? Voice of the people. So he makes the bull. Why do they end up choosing Polk as the candidate in 1844? If they hadn't have chosen Polk, they wouldn't have got even as many votes as they did. So their fears are real. If they wanted to win the 1860 election, Abraham Lincoln had to be their candidate. You want to win the election? Endorse Lincoln. Not an abolitionist. And doesn't that make sense? If the US had not chosen Biden as the Democratic candidate, and they had have chosen Sanders, for example, we would have a Trump second term. Even with Biden, Trump got 74 million votes. So the end result, success. Stop slavery extending over the entirety of the United States. So make careful strategic decisions. Endorse smaller, moderate steps. Don't go and intervene in the affairs of the southern states. Support the freedom of the people in the southern states to choose their own future. endorse Biden, prevent Trump having a second term. Strategic steps. If you think about it, it's all reasonable. Even right. And yet prophecy continually shines a light on it as being wickedness. Saying this is what the movement needs to see is wrong. This is what is wrong externally. So what is wrong internally? It's been all too easy in this movement to want to preserve peace. Because no one wants a civil war. No one wants to deal with angry ministries. Or leaders who feel their rights are being trampled upon. That Parminder and I are engaging in foreign intervention. When we go to another country and say you are not allowed to practice the dowry system. For a while in this movement, I've seen that a true fight for equality will bring about civil war in this movement. And it's easy to feel that to have peace, success, unity, more people, to not engage in that fight. I would suggest that to make such an argument, that the end peace justifies the means compromise. We are no longer permitted to take. God chose the story of the Apis bull as being precisely what we needed to understand in this history. And it's heading towards the formalization of a message. The formalization of a message is always a fight. We're dealing with ministries in this movement on an organizational level, and almost every one of those organizational issues are not about paperwork, or respecting structure. It's hand-to-hand combat with nationalism and sexism. When a ministry decides that they want to run a camp meeting and 2 men on that board drive the women of that board, that there must be one, and they decide to go to a fellowship to provide financial assistance for that camp meeting, and they go to one man, even though a woman was placed in leadership role, and this one man goes to 2 other men, not to her, to seek their agreement for that project. And all of that is kept separate from the woman continental leader We are not fighting organisational battles, we're fighting battles of sexism. When 2 little children in this movement are raped, and the family in their heartache inform a board member of that movement, and that male board member takes 5 days to inform his board, when he is forced to do so, and then they take 2 weeks to inform the continental leader, and then they write a report that is somehow devoid of the word rape. The organisational combat of this dispensation is not disconnected from the message. The reason that there is a need for intervention is because 18 months ago we were promised change. This was easy. Elder Jeff just said, don't want any of it. This is hard. Because so many people have said, we believe in change. We're with you, Tess. We'll stand by your side and fight this together. And what God says? They abandoned the form and not the spirit. And it cannot, will not be tolerated inside this movement. When a woman leader is told that her organisational letters are too cold, by members of a sexist boys' club, this is not an issue of organisation, it's an issue of sexism. Something they would not say to a male leader. If they want a warm, motherly figure, Catholicism is more than happy to provide that. Because then you get one that's also pretty and a virgin, worth more. I see brothers commenting on this chat who I know are failing equality. When they call their female leaders cold and tell them they can just do whatever they want. And the problem is that to maintain peace, so that you stay in the movement, I will no longer say that the end justifies the means. We will intervene. It's not foreign intervention. I do not represent Australia. But the message of equality was not that ministry leaders had the right to practice inequality without our intervention. As if the South had the freedom to practice slavery without the intervention of the executive government. And almost every organisational conflict in this movement comes down to the failure of the issues of nationalism and sexism. There was a sister in Arkansas that had a major issue with this movement. She said too many people hadn't changed. And the principle of what she said was correct. She knew it, I knew it. If we can be united on the message, every part of it, all I'm asking is that instead of leaving, we fight together. And sisters are not devoid of failing when it comes to equality. If you think a woman in your fellowship is committing adultery, and you were wrong, by the way, and you start contacting her husband, then you are stepping between two women. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Amy Coney Barrett. No matter your gender, no matter your race. If you're a woman, you're going to behave badly and attack other women, you will find yourself at odds with me too. This is the dispensation of organisation. The reason it's the dispensation of organisation is because the message of equality came, and what God said is you will bring the message of equality into line with the organisation of this movement. So if it seems like Parminder and I and your continental leaders are absent, so it's because we're intervening in too many southern states. Where that organisational structure must be put in place not to take people's freedoms, but to protect the people who are actually vulnerable. And I never had the intention of doing this work alone. It needs people. I've been disappointed at some of the people I thought would fight by my side. And for whatever reason, often tiredness, they have not done so. It will get more intense. It always does at the formalisation. The Apis Ball study was just the warning of that. But it must be insisted upon. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we look back at the last 18 months and we see too much compromise for the sake of peace. We do not wish to needlessly damage souls, but we cannot excuse sexism and racism. We see it exhibited time after time. I hope that you will grant wisdom to the members of this movement, that they will turn their eyes inward, look to see where they have attacked their own sisters and brothers, with rebellion and sexism, and that many might straighten out these problems with empathy and love, to do what is right regardless of consequences. You said this movement is success. May we not try to preserve that success. By compromising on issues of equality. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.